This is like a really practical question, and I don't know if you have an answer for it, but you brought up policy, and legal cases and places to go and look. And I know that under the auspices of intellectual property, a lot of people sign, agreements now that they're not going to speak publicly about any disputes they have with work. And private arbitration and mediation is becoming more and more popular, which is making it like really hard to find out what's going on inside these places. Have you come across any difficulties along those lines in your research, and how have you answered that?
Yes, we have to do this by, if this is okay, by sub rosa or Chatham House or inter se or entre nosotros rules, if that's okay. I.e., whatever you hear, you can't say to anybody else or communicate to them in any way. Is that all right? But yes, and my examples come from a prominent union in the entertainment sector that is run by Maoists who are seeking an insurrection from within to create leftist discourse in the entertainment products of this industry. Although they don't tell the members that they're Maoists because they would get removed from office. And they were concerned that people working in this particular fraction of the culture industry were being excluded from non-union work because the non-union work was being defined in such a way that even though the legal framework of the particular state that was relevant to this very prominent entertainment sector would have insisted on coverage, but was defined so that it looked as though it didn't apply, but really it did. So the idea was to go to members of this union who were in senior management positions inside the corporations that claimed they weren't involved in making this stuff, but only buying it once it was made, but actually were involved in making it, and therefore it would have fallen under the legislation of this state, and saying to them, can you tell me what this is like and who does the work? Because the members of X union feel as though the work that's being done and the role that you play as this, not CEO, but senior management person in a big organization helps to determine what it looks like, and therefore there should be coverage, right? I couldn't get anybody to talk on the record. Off the record, people would talk, but they wouldn't talk to me. And one of the factors, particularly in the culture industry sectors in California, is that established researchers who are tenured are not regarded as trustworthy. It tends to be, this is obviously not the case in your experience, but it tends to be graduate students who are deemed more trustworthy. And so, rather like the way big science works with labs, it's now the case that more and more senior faculty try to create humanities researchers who work with them for the PhD, but also in a sense do their labor for them in terms of ethnographic investigation. So my answer to you is I think what you said is absolutely right, and there are two other elements. One is mistrust, particularly of senior scholars. It's across the board. Lots of people who work in these areas in California talk about this. And then the use by senior scholars of graduate students to try to get inside these organizations and get information because they're younger and better looking and they're deemed to be less threatening because they're not, professor of blah at the University of X. But certainly there is this fear of what can be disclosed and under what circumstances it can be disclosed. Yeah, there's no question about that. And then, of course, there is the issue as we move out of our safely cloistered worlds of institutional review boards, which are, the bodies that throughout the United States and in many other countries police whom you can talk to and how if you're a scholar within, in some cases, an inch of your lives, for good reason, because they derive from human rights laws that came from the Nuremberg trials and from the Tuskegee experiments. But they are massive blockages in many cases to doing politicized research, and they raise flags for the people you want to go and interview. People who might be prepared to talk to you, but not if they have a 4-page informed consent document that they have to read and sign. And that doesn't just apply at the level of people who are signing non-disclosure agreements. That's at the level of very ordinary people all over the world who are intimidated by that kind of informed consent, even as it's designed to protect them.
To give a sense of what you're up against, if you walk into the door at any Google site whatsoever, you have to sign an agreement to get in the door, no matter who you are, that what you walk out with will remain non-distributed to any source whatsoever.
I didn't know that.
Just a couple of things. Because you mentioned Glasgow. I mean, there's something happened recently, and I wonder if you know anything more about this, where basically the local, what they call the Culture and Leisure Services, which was kind of a public body. It was like kind of municipal arts and culture and so on. It was actually devolved to like basically a private charitable trust. So that's like the first time I've seen of a sort of like privatization of a municipal arts council, and who would think it would happen in a place like Glasgow? I mean, but what was interesting. Do you know about the? What's interesting is that someone wrote an article in Variant magazine about this, and but ended up being in the middle of a huge legal scandal because of that. I mean, and this person and the magazine and the academic department were threatened to be sued.
Wow, I didn't know that. Do you know about either of those things, Kate, perhaps?
A little bit, probably about the same as you, which is, in some ways you think in a place like Glasgow that would be unthinkable because of the history of kind of municipal socialism, but it also has a history of incredibly dirty politics and inequality.
Yeah.
And so there was, to some degree, we need to get the classic, we need to get this out of politics. As we talked about yesterday. The idea that somehow the technocratic solution will work. So out of politics. But it's also happened in Sheffield as well.
Yeah. But what was interesting is that someone wrote an article about this in Variant magazine, which ended up also. I mean, what was interesting about it. On one hand, I mean, they're having to deal with all these issues, like the magazine ended up being basically banned from any institution which was receiving funding from this new charitable trust. But also the issue was, the people who were working there were also going on strike because they didn't want, because they knew that sort of working for a private charity would see their conditions change, and so this article in Variant was being used by the people on strike, and so I think that's an interesting example of kind of getting your hands dirty. I mean, but I was also wondering if in sort of critical cultural policy circles, if you know anyone else who was talking about this, because I've just seen the debate happening in relation to Variant magazine and so on, but not.
Yeah. Well, certainly. I mean, my example from the other day of EA_spouse is an instance of whistleblowing where you feel you have to do it in such a way that there can't be intimidation and so on. There's a whole raft of civil rights attorneys across the United States who work full-time on this because there are lots of state laws and I think some federal ones, but certainly there are very powerful state laws here in California against intimidation and protecting various kinds of whistleblowing. The trouble is workers being aware of them and then workers being able to use them. One of the differences between the United States and most other countries in the world is that the vast majority of successful inroads into the expansion of human rights and cultural justice in this country actually comes through legal cases, right? Much more than conventional politics. It's much more, the way that those achievements are attained, the way that they are policed, the way that they are extended comes from legal precedent and from legal struggles more than anything else, which is why there are so many leftist lawyers in this country, a lot of them working in for-profits actually. You can make money out of doing this. So it's a bit different here from a lot of other places. But the EA_spouse string that produced hundreds of people writing in complaints was instrumental in the generation of the class action lawsuit under California state labor law. So, and that's been analyzed by somebody actually in Canada, which I didn't realize until after I'd done my research on it, but there's a good article on it in the Canadian Journal of Communication. So there are lots, if you look at law journals, and if you look not just at law journals, but at legal proceedings, those cases that are reported, you can find out a lot about this sort of thing, especially in the US, but other countries too. The way in which you can get inside the workings of big media conglomerates in particular in this country is when they're taken to court. It's very hard to know how money really circulates in the making, for example, of a motion picture. But if you have a legal case, there's one over Coming to America, there was one over Alien, you really find out through the force of subpoena where the money comes and goes. Yeah. So that's a good source to go to, especially for those working on the US, because so much of it is so hard to get because a lot of the intelligence is proprietary, commercial in confidence, or the intelligence is held by private research firms, of which there are thousands in this country, where you pay $1,000 or $2,000 for a 5-page report that tells you really how an industry is working and also how it operates in terms of labor issues.
Toby, A question about the critical stance and the political and the political cultural imaginary from which your critical position is stemming. Creative industries discourse is oftentimes attacked because it's seen as basically an advocate of the benefits of a market economy and the radical flexibilization of labor, etc., etc. Cultural policy people are often attacked from cultural studies as too enmeshed with the state, hands too dirty, and oftentimes working for the purpose of extending state domination. I take it that your critical cultural policy position would both engage with the market and the state, but somehow in some different way. Would you mind boiling down to a few points in what ways would that engagement with the market and the state be different from these other two that are so heavily criticized?
I think in terms of the state, in terms of the market, there are lots of things that I think markets are quite good at allocating, and they're fair enough, and I like them. I like lots of choice. I like being able to wear silly shirts and have earrings and decide which ones I wear, and I don't know how you do that without markets. But there are lots of things that should be taken out of the market, and lots of things are taken out of the market. I mean, John Stuart Mill and Adam Smith didn't think education should be driven by the market at all. They were horrified by any such notion. So I think there should be an extension of all sorts of public goods, and that's very strongly my position, okay? So I believe in the extension of public goods. I don't know how they're provided as public goods by and large other than with the participation of the state. So I'm opposed to the increased marketization of everyday life at the same time as I think there are lots of things markets are good for. I think there are lots of things that should be either taken out of the market or in fact are taken out of the market. In the United States, water is taken out of the market, right? It is not taken out of the market increasingly in much of the world. There is a sense, if you think about Raymond Williams and the idea of a common cultural feeling, when you talk to people in the US about the idea of water being privatized, they are horrified, even pro-market people. How could you do that? It's a resource that everybody needs. Well, that's a very interesting structure of feeling moment. So, of course, it's not as though every society at every moment will have the same sorts of things that can be shielded from the market and should be. But water is a very interesting one because in this particular conjuncture, as he spits at the front row, sorry about that, it becomes a way in which you can draw on a structure of feeling to make people think about how much of everyday life they do want to see commodified. When you talk to people who are sports fans in the US, and they're horrified at the idea that their sports teams would have the names of corporations emblazoned on them. Absolutely horrified. Now, this is something that is accepted virtually everywhere else in the world. It is, you will drive people to distraction if you suggest that the Dodgers or the Yankees have, Ford Motor Company written on them. They don't approve of it. There are all kinds of areas where people have these structures of feeling that say there are some things that, although they are touched by the market, should not be dominated by it. So I think there's a lot of energy that can be drawn from those sorts of questions. Similarly, when you talk to people who believe in fun stuff and free stuff and open source, they are saying there are things that are crucial to ordinary life and our futures that should be taken out of the market. Similarly, when you talk to people who don't like the idea that they have to sign EULAs and that gives away their ideas for the future, that's a critique of property. When you talk to people who are concerned about being able to file share, that's a critique of property. Now, how far one takes that critique of property is another matter. But this is the end answer to your question. My compass for what should be given over to the market and what should be given over to the state or taken over by the state or taken over by the market is partly through an historical lens of what seems to work via market choices, right? In part, like what you wear, where you live, where you get your hair cut, things like that, versus things that I don't think historically work very efficiently that way, such as education, health, and so on. And when it comes to specific cases within the cultural realm, I am often driven by the agendas of social movements. They tend to give me my agenda. If there are groups that form that are worried about racial representation or worried about the crackdown on file sharing, then that tells me this is an area where market dynamics and state dynamics are not operating in a satisfactory way, and that gives me my list of what I should work with. So my list of what I should work with doesn't come from me. It doesn't come from an abstract theoretical agenda. It comes from the people that I think, academics who are in privileged Research One institutions, are the people who should set the agenda for them, namely social movements, because we should be like a kiosk where they can come and lay down their ideas, and we may not help them. It's more perhaps often a matter of their helping us, but we can at least promote the agenda in a different forum. So that's where my agenda comes from. It's not from an abstract theoreticist paradigm about state-market relations, although that's relevant to me. It's much more, what are people out there saying who are living through this experience? Yeah, you need to understand the difference between what I'm describing, what I'm prescribing, what I'm proscribing. Sometimes there's overlap, sometimes there isn't. But in terms of artists and writers and so on, lots of them kick against this model very strongly for the reasons you've ably outlined. And I honor and admire them for doing that, at the same time as they are living out in a very obedient way, a very conventional ideology of the artist and the author. It's one we've had for a couple of centuries since authors and artists were ideologized as having an occupational space. Well, it is that I am an autonomous creative subject, I am struck by a muse, I have a unique capacity to capture the times. You don't have this, you just have to create the circumstances for me to do my work and get out of the way. That ideology is extremely powerful, but they are being exceptionally obedient to it. Exceptionally obedient to it. So it is one that is easily controlled and patrolled by creative industries discourse, because we know about that occupational position, right? So I'm not sure that it actually undercuts or undermines creative industries discourse, although it's a useful first point of critique. But again, it is playing out a role that, you know, where almost every word, every phrase has been heard before. So I don't think it's actually all that different or divisive, because it's a script. Now, in terms of the first point about human subjects research, I like your formulation, and I think it's absolutely correct, that this can be incredibly frustrating. It can get in the way of good research. It can intimidate all sorts of community interviewees. It can make action research of a kind that Dick was explaining hard to do. There are tendencies within universities that are opposed to IRBs, or institutional review boards, that are in favor of academic freedom. So, for instance, various parts of the Senate, Academic Senate of the University of California, have committees on academic freedom that struggle with IRBs. If you're part of a professional association, then professional associations can get exemptions. If you're doing oral history, it's exempt nationally, as long as you're a member of the Oral History Association of the United States. The reason why oral historians are exempt from this in this country, the National Science Foundation has said it's okay, you don't have to do it, is because they are not doing what is deemed to be replicable, generalizable research. They're doing one-off empiricist activities. Anything you're doing that is deemed to be experimental, i.e. generalizable, is included within the remit of IRBs. Anything that is meant to be, this is just about one person's past experience, that's exempt. Because the oral history people went to the NSF and got it done. The risks in not being obedient to the human subjects tutorials and so on are very significant indeed. The reason why universities force you to do this, and not just universities do it, pharmaceutical companies and so on, there are people who are trained philosophers in the United States who make millions of dollars by sitting on private sector IRBs all over the country, all over the world, right, as ethical consultants, along with scientists on these bodies. The reason why universities require you to do this is that any tertiary institution in the United States that gets money from the federal government of any kind must undertake human subjects rules, governance, in order not to jeopardize all of that money, right? This is thanks to Ted Kennedy when he was responding to the Tuskegee situation back in the 70s. And therefore, universities will come down very hard on people who don't obey these rules because of the risks to them. Because remember, large fractions of, for instance, NSF, NIH, NIMH, i.e. Science Foundation, Institutes of Health, Institute of Mental Health monies that universities get actually directly fund administrators. So that's one of the reasons why administrators push you to do more and more funded research, those of you who work in research universities, because more and more of their jobs are directly sponsored by that. So there are big risks. I'm not suggesting you shouldn't, of course, push the envelope on that, and I admire, you know, both your account of your experience and also suggesting that we need to do something about this. A good way of doing it, is to get involved in academic freedom committees and get involved with your relevant professional association for them to push to say, really, this is about experimenting on people's bodies and brains in harmful ways. We are not doing that. We are working with communities to discuss matters of import to them and get some stock exemptions.
Of the artist, then how would you break away from that script? I mean, artists are involved. I think, again, I'm going to go back to community artists, people who work in the community. They don't seem to work that script. I don't think that's...
No.
Again, that particular script you described are artists and people whose work is very, it seems to me, very commercial again.
Yeah.
You know,
Community artists have a different script, also very common. It's the script that George's book, Culture as Resource, explains very extensively, right? The governmentality idea. I'm here representing a community. I'm not here representing myself. The community speaks through me. I speak through the community. I'm deeply connected to it, and so on. Now, the point about that is that it, too, has been easily harmonized with creative industries discourse and with cultural policy discourse. Because it's, I mean, if you look, for instance, at Chon Noriega's work, when he explains how the Chicano-Chicana arts movement articulated to various struggles in the area of media reform in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that is about the successful governmentalization of the Chicano-Chicana arts movement. If you look at the way Tomás Ibarra Frausto writes about these questions, it's exactly about that. Now, there are struggles and tensions within the movements over that tendency, right? But the successful policy inroads that were made are about being able to say, these people stand for the community, their work has popular legitimacy, they are therefore artists whose work not only in itself should be valorized and supported, but whose work stands for what other artists work, what work in other media should get by way of subvention, attention, legal protection, and so forth. So I think that, yes, there is that other model, and it's very, very important, but it's not as though it stands outside this world in a comprehensive way. It is both informed by and informing that other world, and has been particularly in, say, in Los Angeles for 4 or 5 decades.
Toby, I have a question on the ways in which you framed the sort of crisis of the humanities debate, mostly in sort of Anglo-American context of the science wars. And I was wondering if you had a couple of thoughts on the ways in which this sort of debate or the crisis of humanities happen in different cultural contexts. And the second part of my question relates to the ways in which other cultures, notably South American, Latin American, and Caribbean, frame the sort of distinction between popular culture and high culture, in the sense that my understanding is that there's this term culture which englobes both lowbrow culture and high culture as well in different contexts.
Could you say a bit more about the first one? Because I only half understood.
The ways in which the crisis of the humanities debate is predicated upon the idea of this distinction between the hard sciences and the soft sciences out of the Anglo-American context.
Right. Well, let me have a go at that second, because I understood the second question better, and come back to me and interrogate me about the first one, because I've got an answer, but it may be to another question. Is the answer to, do I have a comb? No, I have two. Right? So, on the score of the way it's done in a lot of these issues are played out in Latin America, there, even at the level, but I'm particularly thinking of Mexico, but it applies in some other places as well. Even at the level of official policy, Gramsci's idea of the national popular is tremendously important. Right? There are lots of people who would be regarded as to the wacky far left in the US, who are even members of reasonably conservative parties, who subscribe to Gramsci's idea of the national popular as the way you build a formation. Right? They even use this language. And if you look at a place like Mexico and you see the fact that, in a sense, every town you go to, in the Zócalo, which means plinth, but it's really the town square, the big plinth in the town square will probably have a kind of workerist, Stakhanovite image of an indigenous Mexican. So indigeneity and labor are heroized and made into this national popular in a way that completely belies what everyday life is like for indigenous people and for workers, right? So, but that national popular, most spectacularly clear there, but you can see it in other places as well, is very much done on a Gramscian model, i.e., you know, popular culture does not necessarily mean mass media in the old sense of the term. Popular culture does not have to mean that which comes from on high economically to be successful with ordinary people. It is actually what the popular classes, as they're called in that situation, produce themselves, right? So it's folkloric or it's community. That is very much part of popular culture in the understanding you get in Latin America. However, just getting back to my answer to Alejandro, again, if you look at George's work or Garcia Canclini's work or Eduardo Nivon's work, you can see the way in which these activities have increasingly become part of both formal community initiatives, formal community building, rather than apparently organic responses thereto, and part of tourism plans, right? So that national popular is definitely there in this sort of Gramscian mode, sometimes involving ideas of conflict rather than harmony, sometimes very radical and very progressive, at least in its iconography, and yet very much in harmony with all sorts of bureaucratic plans for how to construct an obedient populace that believes in a national historical myth that will paper over differences. But when you encounter these things as someone from the outside, particularly from here in the US, they can often appear astonishingly radical and transformative and exciting, as indeed I think they are. But you've got to remember, these are obviously some of these countries have very long authoritarian pasts and grotesque forms of anti-democratic rightism and some anti-democratic leftism, quite a bit of it. But nevertheless, when it comes to this cultural realm, there is this sense of a national popular. And then there's an Althusserian idea as well, although not always couched in that language, of relative autonomy of culture from other zones, as something that can be protected as well as commodified and governed. Protected because it is the essence or the spirit of the people, in the way Alejandro was talking about, a sort of mystic, mythic Geist, a spirit indwelling in persons. On the score of the first question, the one I didn't, I think, really get, but maybe I didn't get the other one either, which is the science wars. You know, it's certainly the case that in many countries, people in science and medicine, and to a lesser extent law, run the agendas of big universities that have comprehensive education in both the professions and across the more general degrees. But it's spectacularly true here, because one of the reasons why I keep being quoted as saying I miss the Cold War is that the Cold War gave the impetus to the massive expansion of big science in the US. And big science generated lots of relative autonomy, right, for other people to get what were, in a sense, cross-subsidized areas of inquiry and activism that were quite antithetical to the Cold War, but got money nevertheless. If you think about, for example, the way in which anti-Marxist leftism was directly funded and certainly tolerated by everybody from the CIA through to university administrators in the period from the mid-50s through to the early 90s, right? That's why you get so many people sent overseas on the State Department's dime without even knowing that they're getting the State Department's dime to go and give talks, because they are progressive leftists who will criticize racism and sexism in the US but will not talk about class, right? And all sorts of other things go on that are extremely interesting, providential and fascinating. We're getting it again a bit today in the post-Cold War era in terms of Islamic issues and in terms of making nice with countries that the Bush administration has had a bad relationship with. So the State Department is pouring in, about $500 million a year now to send academics and creative workers overseas who will talk about problems in the US to do with race and gender, but will not talk about US imperialism and will not talk about class dynamics, inequality, the role of the cultural sector as propaganda, and so on. And there are probably people in this room who, without knowing it, have gone around the world to give talks. If they're US citizens, no matter what their politics are, as long as they're not Marxist, they've been invited to world conferences, they go, and only later on, if at all, do they discover that the State Department gave money to the Greek council on this or the Mexican council on that to have them talk. So that's the story here. Many other countries, including developing countries, have wanted to have that big science move. The problem for Latin America that they're constantly trying to tackle is the same problem that China's trying to tackle, which is how much of their annual income is, in a sense, unearned, where you're not doing anything. You're living from royalties, right? You're living from patents. You're living from copyrights. You're living from IP, where you don't have to do a thing for generations. It just comes to you. It's the core of the United States success in movies, in music, in television, in pharmaceuticals, and so on. How do you get that to happen? And the problem is that in terms of patents each year, about 3% in the world come from Latin America. 3%. About 30% comes from the United States. A lot comes from Tokyo, from Japan, a lot from Western Europe. And they really dominate this. They're the people that invent something that is, in old-fashioned British terms, a nice little earner, i.e. money that just comes to you without your doing anything. Not because you've struck lucky and put money into the bank, but because you have a process, an application, a story that people keep wanting to use and where you have intellectual protection of it. So that's really the key to the way big science reasserts itself again and again. Means of technologizing everyday life and then maintaining intellectual control over it, legal control over it, so that you have a revenue stream forever and ever. That's what I meant when I talked about getting away from minerals and masses and getting into software and stories. That's what you need to get control of. That's what all these countries are after. And that's why big science can always reassert itself in third world areas as well as here.
A really brilliant account of the relation of the history of cultural studies and cultural industries. I think we should all feel privileged to be present at a preface to a book we now all then have to read. So thanks for that. It was quite amazing. I'd like to just put on the table 3 related considerations to ask in relation to this historical and prehistorical formation that you've laid out, and see what you have to say to them. There's an emerging debate going on in the educational arena at both the tertiary, secondary, and indeed primary educational formations in foundations and so on, around problem solving as the ground for all education, right? So that there's this move now to thinking about problem solving, which of course then poses a particular problem for the humanities, right? Insofar as the humanities largely are not resonant with or ordered around issues of problem solving. And of course that kind of reductionist singularity about how and what people learn includes all kinds of domains in learning. I mean, how does, say, language learning take place in relation to problem solving? How does critical thinking take place? Reflective thinking and so on and so forth. Philosophical thinking. And so a whole range of areas tend to get included. So I wonder what the relation is between this notion of problem solving as the modality of learning and education in relation to this focus on cultural industries, sort of as a relation. The second then has a kind of deeper underpinning, which I think is connected to this conception of problem solving, and that is the role of utilitarianism. As a philosophical commitment that dominated from the 1870s to the 1950s, right, in Anglo-American education and self-conception, in a way got a little discounted by Rawls and the kind of Rawlsian moment from the late 50s to the maybe arguably the mid-1980s or the emergence of neoliberalism,
right.
And then reappears in the guise of cost-benefit analysis, risk analysis, questions of uncertainty, the assessment of uncertainties and so on. And I think is also deeply connected to this set of considerations out of which the notion of cultural industries emerges. And then the third element, just
Another world historical moment coming up.
yeah.
Okay.
Another is the shift in what one might call epistemological economy that we were talking about over dinner last night, and that is the way in which the claim to truth is both to truth and to warranted assertability, right? So has been eroded in all kinds of domains. I mean, it's a shift to what I'm calling make-believe as the dominant epistemological conception. The concern is no more so longer with a claim to what is true or false in the world, whether it's in politics, whether it's amongst your colleagues, the possibility of saying I did all kinds of things when in fact there's no justification of that. I don't mean you should all go and reinvent your Vita, but if you look around, many of your colleagues do, quite frankly, right? You just have to scratch the surface of this. So it's so what is, and so the question is, in this emergence of what I'm calling a kind of new epistemological authority or new epistemological economy, is there, is it the case that in a certain kind of erosion, right, what you get left with in relation to the domain of culture precisely is cultural industries, right? That cultural industries is the kind of predictable outcome, right, where narrative and fabrication in both senses of the word, both the making up, right, and the making of the fabric of a culture is the only possibility.
Yeah. Well, on the third one, my inner Adorno will meet my inner truck driver in about 3.5 minutes. I promise to shut up and sit down then, Kate. So on the first issue, the problem solving as an educational basis, I actually wasn't aware of that debate, so thank you for telling me. I have two remarks. One is conceptual, political, the other is experiential. Part of the question is who's defining the problems and who's also working for the solutions. If the problems are defined in a social movement sense as well as a statist or commercial sense, then it doesn't have to be such a bad thing. But like a lot of things that involve cost-benefit analysis or even scientific management, the problem is who's doing the measuring and who's doing the policing. So I think if one can open that up, it doesn't have to be so bad. And that relates to my second answer, which is the experiential one. I was lucky enough to teach in the late 80s, early 90s at two universities that were set up as interdisciplinary and that were set up as problem solving in the early 70s. All education had to be undertaken with this in mind. And they were the places that established cultural studies in Australia, right? Murdoch University and Griffith University. So for instance, what that meant was, in terms of saying we're solving problems, and languages was an area that definitely suffered, by the way, but that's also to do with English hegemony and Australian unilingualism. But the way we got around it in the areas where I was working was to say, okay, this means that we need to have research teams always. So and teaching teams. No course would be taught by one person. All courses were taught by between 2 and 4. They were all taught by people with different disciplinary backgrounds. There were no departments. So to teach a media course, you had to have a person who had been trained in textual analysis, a person who'd been trained in policy analysis, a person who'd been trained in economic analysis, and a person who'd been trained in psychological analysis, or you can call it psychoanalysis, call it effect studies, whatever you like. That was what we thought was necessary in order to solve problems. And that was what we were able to live by. Quite extraordinary knowledge base for me as a junior faculty person in those institutions. So if you can get that kind of model going, that's really what generated a lot of critical cultural policy studies and a lot of cultural studies. And it used the problem-solving moniker to construct forms of life not dissimilar to the ones that Dick and Angie came from, they were telling us about the other day, right? So I think it depends on who's defining the problems and who's doing the policing. On the second one, utilitarianism, I can only agree. What we see in a way is the dominance of a Rawlsian model of justice problematized by a Nozick model and on the philosophical side and in terms of educational theory in lots of ways. No question about that. And that is, there's a wonderful story of Gary Becker, whom I mentioned earlier, turning up late for an economics oral doctoral exam at Columbia. This is 20 years before he won the Nobel Prize for Human Capital. And he's late, right? And he's in his car. And he's got to make a judgment. Do I park illegally and get a ticket? Or am I late for this person's viva? And he, in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, he talks about calculating how he'd work with that dilemma. And then, of course, he used this to describe decision-making about everything. everything from looking at divorce rates through to, you know, having children, you name it. So it's the displacement of sociology and history by a Nozick kind of calculus, right? And you see that very, very keenly with also the displacement of on the sort of Rawlsian side at an applied level, Keynes and especially Galbraith, by Hayek and Friedman. So Nozick, Friedman are the sort of inheritors of a Hayekian world / a utilitarian Benthamite Millian world from the previous century. And Galbraith and, Keynes and Rawls are the inheritors of, I don't quite know where you place Rawls in all of this, but a more collectivist position, let's say, right? So I think you're absolutely correct in saying that. But I think there are counter tendencies. If you look at some of the work that Rawls was doing, this is the guy who wrote The Theory of Justice, right? For those of you who haven't read it, The Veil of Ignorance and so on. The later work he did tries to take account of Nozick's critiques. And Nozick himself actually shifted a bit towards the end. So there is a sort of an acknowledgement that the market has some virtues, individual choice has some virtues, and a recognition that in fact markets really don't clear efficiently everywhere and always on the part of the people who are on the other side of that divide. So, and if you look at the success of some of the major economists of today in information theory, they have accepted that there is no such thing as perfect information in lots of market situations and for lots of human subjects. And that you simply cannot always extrapolate from this idea of the ratiocinative person who is in a level playing field and can make uniquely informed decisions for him or herself that will benefit not only him or herself but ultimately everybody through the interplay of supply and demand. So I guess I see some hope in that, but I think your description is absolutely acute. Then quickly on this discussion that we actually had last night, I was thinking back in our conversation to the fact that 10 years ago, lots of us were involved in the science wars. You know, I took over editing social text immediately upon the Sokol affair happening, right? So I was a tangential player at one level and at another level not. And it was certainly the case that in the high point of the Clinton years and the high point of the headiness of a postmodern, post-structuralist critique of big science, it was luxurious to sit around in humanities meetings and dump on these people. I don't hear that being done anymore, and not, I think, just because of the comprehensive defeat that cultural studies suffered over the Sokol issues, justified or not. Not in my opinion, obviously I'm a partisan for social text, justified or not, but actually because what is the single occupational group in the United States that most significantly stands and successfully stands against republicanism? Republicanism as in the R word, as in the political party. It's scientists. 3% of people who are scientists in the United States voted for Bush in 2004. Who are the people who stand up against, for example, the notion that everybody must be spiritual and everybody must be religious, right? And that that is the way and the truth? It's mostly scientists who effectively make that argument. And who are the people who say things like, we need to have people running the store who know what the difference is between a door and a window? It's technocrats who say things like, under Clinton, FEMA for the first time was not just a place where you sent people who knew nothing about emergency management, but where you sent people who were trained experts in emergencies. Under Carter, under Reagan, under the first Bush, it was people by masters of the king's buckhounds type people, like Brownie. Only, in fact, under Clinton was it run by people who knew what they were doing. That critique of the necessity to have Weberian, bureaucratized, experienced, professional experts running things, instead of people who, you know, run a horse association and therefore can do federal emergency management. That came from people who had a lot of faith in the absolutism of truth and the profundity of professional expertise. And lots of us who were very dubious about big science, especially in the 1990s, shut up about it in the 21st century. And those of us who might have grouped ourselves behind Latour on the basis that Latour was seen as a critic of science now realize that he never was, certainly isn't now. Right? So I think there is, you know, the Supreme Court has a concept of epistemological humility It's a relativistic understanding of truth that is one of the cores, right, of US law. And it says that it actually inscribes the notion that truth is relative. The reason it inscribes that notion in much case law is to let corporations off the hook when they poison or kill or injure you. How could they have known? And that also informs the way that a lot of US cost-benefit analysis works. As Rick was explaining the other day, the way that potential harms are analysed in the US as opposed to Western Europe. In Western Europe, the basic model, though it's not always adhered to, is this might be a risk, we don't know, therefore we'll treat it as a risk. The basic model in the US is, you haven't proven to me this is a risk, therefore it isn't. And this is a massive divide, which sometimes gets played out in market terms. Sometimes the products that we consume in the US, because the European market's bigger, actually adhere to the tighter restrictive regulatory norms in Europe, and sometimes it's the other way around. Or sometimes, sorry, the US market is bigger and therefore it's less regulation dominates. So it's not as though I'm suggesting that there is an absolutism of scientific truth that dominates in the US historically, that was smashed under the Republicans because of this epistemological humility doctrine and the way that cost-benefit analysis has always been conducted here. Nor am I suggesting, B, that we need to celebrate the big science model of absolute truth anyway. But I do think it's necessary to think about these things partly in conjunctural historical terms, and that we're at a moment in history where it's just the case that the big science cultural studies critiques have fallen flat on their faces and no one wants to subscribe to them. We desperately need people in this country who can spell and add up. And I don't mean the people amongst the population. I mean the people who are running government departments. I mean the people who are in the cabinet. We need competent, applied intellectuals, which you used to get quite a lot of in the Republican administrations. You always get a lot of in Democrat administrations, and you have very few of today. I think everybody recognizes that, and I think that's actually at the core of the massive unpopularity of the current president, that he presided over a kind of masters of the king's buckhounds model of dispensation of monies, of power rather, in return for money, and that therefore a lot of us would like some kind of return to Weberian rationality.
In ways Toby was responding to, undercuts the authority of truth claims, either in absolute terms or in its pragmatist terms as warranted assertability. Right? Both of those have been profoundly eroded in the last decade, or longer, but certainly smashed in the last decade. So that the possibility of saying anything, so long as it can get people to believe it, is now on the table. Whether it's in terms of fabricating stories for the New York Times, whether it's in terms of fabricating political biographies or political histories, whether it's in terms of fabricating readers for the Academy, and so on and so forth. I mean, I think there are lots and lots and lots of examples you can now point to. And what I'm asking, as an hypothesis, as you put it, is what happens to the relation between the humanities and the industrial, in terms of cultural industries, right, in the wake of that shift in epistemological economy? So are you left with only, as you hinted at it, right, narration and storytelling, right, in both creative senses and moving senses on the one hand, and in the other in terms of a more perverse and troubling sense of making, right? And Toby's recourse to a kind of Weberian rationality is in response to that possibility. So I think there is an interesting conversation to be had. Now is maybe not the time, but somewhere in the rest of the week.
Yeah, I think it's why some people are turning back to Adorno, and instead of misreading and attacking him like a lot of us did in the 70s and 80s, realizing that Adorno and Horkheimer the same had profound things to say about this. If you reread Horkheimer's Critique of Instrumental Reason, And if you reread Adorno's culture industry stuff and their collective stuff on culture industries, they both knew television was here to stay, for example, was extremely interesting, that it had active audiences, all the things they're alleged not to have recognized by their know-nothing critics, but that there were serious problems with them in terms of the institutionalization of a dream model that was not necessarily unfortunate or wrong in itself. Dreams can be pleasurable, dreams can be inevitable, fantasies are good things to have and to work with. We saw that in the wet dream slide. But because of the industrialized model of fantasy making and distribution and what that occluded and excluded. I think that responding to what Juan and David said is exactly what people are doing when they are rereading these folks who've been assigned to the dustbin of intellectual history in cultural studies too soon.